Chapter 4. Perils. Rescues. Perils to the rescue. Pidge ran down the hall, the communicator clutched in her hands, and the words, "I'm gonna get in trouble for this," running through her mind in an endless repeat. She didn't care. All of her leads had come up dry. There wasn't any way of getting better ones that wouldn't also carry the risk of disaster. And every day that passed was another day in durance vile for those she loved best. Allura would just have to cope. So would Shiro, even though she felt guilty for picking his pockets. He, at least, wanted to help, but his military training forced him to recite long lists of reasons why he couldn't. They were good reasons, but she didn't have to like them. Yes, the strange Galra woman had helped them, up to a point. She'd told them the truth about the last Altean colony, and so far every other fact and suggestion she'd made had been as good, and the probe they'd sent after her ship when she'd made the mail run to Earth had showed that she was, so far, trustworthy. It was on the strength of this that Pidge had decided to take matters into her own hands. Right now she was somewhere in the deserted west wing of the castle, where most of the guest rooms were back when the castle had been a functioning seat of government. She slid into one dim suite and locked the door before sitting down on the bed and staring at the slim little bit of alien technology. It didn't look like much, just a navy blue rectangle with a large round silver button in the center. It seemed a flimsy thing to base her hopes on, but at this point she was willing to try anything. Carefully, she extended a finger and touched the button. There was a faint hum, and a ring of golden light outlined the button, and then a series of faint, odd sounds, like someone running through tall grasses, emanated from the communicator. There was a scrabbling sound like claws on bark, and a soft, unfamiliar word muttered in a woman's voice. "Awkward, but it'll do," Pidge heard the voice say, and then, "Greetings, Paladins, what do you need?" Pidge swallowed hard. "Sorry, did I call it a bad time?" There was a brief, surprised silence from the other end. "Not really. I'm out hunting with the dragons, and they're better at it than I am, anyway. You'd be one of the other 3 paladins, I assume. Which one, if it may be said?" "The Green Lions," Pidge answered. "I'm Pidge." "Ah, good. That lion has a reputation for choosing pilots who like to ask interesting questions. Go ahead." Pidge blinked and marshaled her thoughts. "I need you to find someone for me," she began breathlessly. "The 2 other humans who were kidnapped along with Shiro. You met him, he's the one with the robot arm." "Yes, excellent fellow. He did mention that his companions had been sent to a work camp somewhere. He told me no more than that. I assume that they mean something significant to you?" Pidge shivered. She was taking risks here. "My family. My father and brother. I need to rescue them." "Ah." The Galra woman paused. Somewhere in her distance, something bellowed. "I assume that this call isn't exactly authorized?" "No," Pidge whispered. "How could you tell?" There was a soft sigh. "My goodness, but you're young. Your tone of voice, of course, and your willfulness. You're taking an enormous chance on me, Paladin. I could very easily use this against you and your team. Even the mention of the fact to certain individuals that you've got family in captivity could doom you." "I'm willing to take that risk," Pidge retorted. "The only reason I'm still here is that this is the best chance I've got of finding them. I'm willing to risk asking you because you've played straight with us so far, and because you're not trying to get me to trust you. If you'd tried to reassure me, I would have turned this thing off and hijacked a cruiser or something instead." Laughter came through the communicator. "Young you may be, but you're smart. Indeed, most Galra men are as subtle as a bandsaw sandwich. I'll look around for your kin, Pidge, though it may take me a while. 2 slaves taken from a fringe world and discarded as too weak to fight are a little tricky to track. It may be harder for you, however. Remember, work camps are harsh places for those without strength, and yours have been held in at least one for over a year. I might find them, but they might not be whole, alive, or sane, and they may or may not be possible to rescue even if they do live. I can't make any promises other than that I will seek them out. I'm sorry." Pidge swallowed hard on a suddenly dry throat. "I have to know for sure." "I understand. I'll contact you immediately when I have an answer for you, and then you can start plotting a rescue or a revenge. Hope for rescue, Pidge. It would drive the Emperor absolutely mad to know that he'd missed his chance for a proper hostage drama. Understood, Pidge said a little hoarsely. Signing out. Good luck. Her theft of the communicator did not go unnoticed, of course. Shiro was one of those meticulous types that had a place for everything and noticed when something wasn't in its place. Then had followed the predictably ludicrous interlude where Lance had tried being the great detective and had tried to pin the whole thing on Keith. Keith, equally predictably, had objected with great energy, and Hunk and Karan had had to forcibly separate them. Shiro, who was so sensible and competent that Pidge had mentally labeled him as Space Dad, had deduced the correct answer almost immediately, and now she was being asked to explain herself. It was harder than she'd thought it would be, especially considering Allura's antipathy toward anything Galra. Allura might have liked to maintain an air of royal dignity and grace, but she could deliver a withering scold with the best of them. Pidge, however, could only be shouted at for a limited time before shouting back. She was explaining very loudly and angrily, and with the help of some words that she'd picked up in the boys' dorm at the garrison, that she was only acting as a paladin for the purpose of locating her family. That was her foremost priority now, and further service to the Lions was contingent on whether or not they could be brought to safety, when something in her pocket went beep. Pidge squeaked and dug the communicator out, stabbing at the button before anyone could take it from her. "I'm here!" "Good. You're just the person I wanted to speak to," the familiar voice said sharply. "I've found them. If there's one thing the Empire does well, it's to keep good documentation. They're alive, and I think they're recoverable if you can convince your teammates that we can work together." Pidge leveled a fulminating glare at Allura. "Go ahead." Sam and Matt Holt are currently being held in the Atelca shipyard, where small spacecraft are made and serviced. It's in one of the more thickly populated sectors, I'm afraid, and is heavily patrolled. Parzoi sector, first quadrant, Sonar system, in orbit around Tenmarok 3. It used to be one of the old Altean colony worlds, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. "That's great," Pidge said, vastly relieved. "How do you—" "Absolutely not!" Allura barked angrily, attempting to snatch the communicator out of Pidge's hands and failing. "How do I know that you're not leading us into a trap? Give me that, you little—" "Ah. And you, young lady, are Princess Allura?" The chuckle that came from the communicator made the princess steam. "You have nothing but my word to go on, of course. Considering what my empire did to yours, I can't ask you to believe anything I say. I will not ask you to trust me. In addition, I will not ask you to risk the Lions." That startled Allura. "What?" "I have advantages that you don't. All I have to do to gain access to that shipyard is to bring my ship in for servicing. The tricky part will be in stealing 2 slaves. It would be a great help, although not absolutely necessary, if Voltron himself were to show up in the outer orbits of that planet, drop his pants and make a crude gesture, and then to run away. All I need is a distraction and a little chaos. Every Galra ship's captain knows of the reward for capturing a lion, and of the penalty for failing to do so." Someone snickered. Pidge ignored it. "We can do that, maybe, if I can shout the princess down. What happens if I can't?" "Then we'll rescue them anyway." There was a faint murmured question in the man's voice in the background. "Yes, I know, Modri, it's no better. All that does is transfer them from one bad spot into an unknown one. All the same, a weapon taken from his hands is a weapon that he cannot use. Small blades kill just as surely as large ones, and you know it." The male voice murmured again. "Don't be silly. Soluk and Tilla wouldn't allow it. I'm not going to break that trust. A rendezvous can be arranged later, and the ship's big enough to house everybody comfortably for a while. They'll probably want medical attention as well." "Wait, so you're going to go after them whether or not we agree to this?" Shiro asked sharply. "Yes. If you come along, you can make sure that we not only succeed in bringing them away, but are able to deliver them to you with all speed. If you don't, you take the risk of leaving them in our hands until we can pass them into your care at a later date. If the Emperor gets his hands on them before we do, you will have to consider the possibility of having to make a sacrifice that may destroy the Green Paladin's trust in the rest of you." We can do this alone. It will just be a great deal easier if we have your help." "If I may be allowed to speak," the man's voice said diffidently, paused, and continued. "You are Shiro, yes? The one referred to as the champion. I remember a tall, pale man, dark-haired with a white forelock, and a battle arm on the right. I was mostly a tank with big grasping pincers at that point." "Yes, that was me," Shiro shuddered. "I remember you." "You shattered my treads, split my claws, and broke my dorsal support elements." Shiro swallowed hard, but was puzzled at Modri's tone. It hadn't sounded angry. "Yes, I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. Allow me to thank you instead," Modri continued quietly. "If you had not done that, I would be dead and burned, my ashes orbiting that cursed place for all eternity, or worse, rebuilt into something even more vile. You made it possible for my lady to rescue me from that fate, and for that alone I will never be able to repay you fully. Allow me this. I will help Lazen free your teammates' family, and to deliver them to you alive and as well as may be. Believe me, I have no love whatsoever for the Emperor and his witch. You saw what they did to me. You understand how much that sort of thing hurts." Shiro's metal hand clenched. "I do." "Yes." There was a faint sigh. "Green Paladin, Pidge. I am not as strong as I once was, and will need your kin to cooperate with me. What can I say to them that will keep them from running from me?" Pidge shot another defiant look at Allura. "Tell them that Katie Holt sent you, and that Mom says no, they can't go back to Kerberos. She doesn't care how much they like freeze-dried peas. They've missed enough home-cooked meals as it is." There was a soft chuckle. "I will tell them that. Few things are more powerful than the word of a mother." "Indeed," Lazen spoke up again. "I can be at Atelca's shipyard in as little as 2 days. Will you come? Princess Allura, you are the commander of lions. This is your decision." Allura stared in helpless fury at the communicator, and then looked up at the paladins. They were staring silently at her, anxious, undecided. Even Karan's imperturbability had been shaken. He shifted his weight uneasily. "We can get there in about 3, give or take an hour or 2. If we're careful, we could do it." Allura hissed. "You've given me no choice, curse you." "On the contrary, I have. It's just a very difficult one, and I'm sorry for that. Choose, Princess. You and I have all the time in the world, but those 2 captives might not." "Granted. Very well, we will be there in 3 days. However, if you betray us—" Lazen laughed. "Yes, yes, dear, I know. You will curse us with the 10,000 plagues of pustulant pestiferousness. You will hunt us to the ends of the universe. You will skin us for throw rugs and make our skulls into drinking cups. You will kill us to pieces and eat the pieces, yes?" "Worse. I will let Pidge have you," Allura said darkly. "Good gods, that would be 100 times worse, wouldn't it?" Modri said. "Indubitably. Signing out, Princess. We'll see you anon." The communicator went dark. Hunk chuckled. "I still like her. She sounds like my aunt." "Shut up, Hunk," Allura growled. "Wow," Hunk said. "I sure hope that you know what you've gotten us into, Pidge," Keith grumbled. Pidge didn't dignify that with an answer. Her nerves were as tightly strung as piano wires at the moment, and she had the nasty feeling that if she tried to speak, she'd end up screaming. It had been a difficult 3 days. It was indeed a very busy system. There were ships everywhere, and not all of them recognizably Galra. Roughly half of them were the dark purple, sharply angled craft used by the Empire to keep the rest in line, but the others were a wild assortment of shapes and sizes that ranged from simple silver teardrop shapes to a huge and intricate thing that seemed to be a collection of fish bows held together with flexible piping. The planet below had obviously been resettled by the Empire, but it was equally obvious that the focal point of the civilization here was the shipyard. It was enormous, taken up mostly with an octopus's convention of orbital docks where countless starships were being built and serviced, all centered around a control complex that looked like a jumble of odd angles in the regulation purple. Communications towers bristled everywhere, and patrols of fighter craft zoomed around it like flocks of starlings. It was an incredibly risky target, and so far the castle was staying well out of it. They were currently tucked up beside the wreckage of an old space station some considerable distance away. From their seats in the Lions, the paladins had an excellent view. "Look there," Shiro said suddenly, flagging an image on his screen for the benefit of the others. "That ship, the one that looks like a lot of blue eggs, that's Lizen's ship." "Weird-looking thing," Lance observed. "I keep expecting it to hatch." "We've just had a message burst from the Chimera's clutch, which is apparently the craft belonging to our friends there," Karan informed them. "We're to wait until a signal before we get our turn. That will mean that they've got your family, Pidge, and we're to cover their escape. We'll meet up a few systems away, off by El Barras, to bring them on board, after which we'll all go our own ways. Hardly any trouble for us at all." Hunk groaned. "You've just jinxed us, you know. Everything's gonna get crazy now, I just know it. Way to go, man." Aboard the Chimera's clutch, things were progressing a little more calmly. Lizen had visited the station numerous times before to get her oddly shaped antique craft serviced. It was one of the few places left that could, since the race that had built it had perished at the hands of the Emperor well over 300 years prior. She had only two concerns on this trip. Firstly, that on her previous visit the station master had been old and nearing retirement. He may have been replaced by now. Secondly, she was worried about Mori, who hadn't recovered as much of his old strength as he would like her to believe. Still, he stood boldly enough in the dark blue uniform of a senior star drive technician, a uniform that he'd once been entitled to wear, and he had tools in his kit that would make the question of identification and access moot. The dragons were right behind them, which was heartening. Very little could withstand an enraged Stampedry prairie dragon, much less two of them. "Atelca main tower, come in," Lizen said in her best casual voice. "Chimera's clutch here, coming in to have my in-system jets looked at. A fast fix, those, and if necessary she could move the ship without damaging anything much if the worst happened." "Is Sanduk still stationed, Master?" "We read you, Chimera, and we're happy to see you," the Tower Master replied promptly, popping on screen with a smile. "We'll have your jets tuned up in no time flat. Got all new repair drones just last year. Old Sanduk retired last month, I'm afraid, and he'll be devastated that he missed you, but he really wanted to spend time with his grandnephews. Watch your shorts around the new guy, though. Karzoon's young and full of fire, and he's got some bad habits. If you've got any small pets aboard ship, make sure that they stay aboard or he'll nix them for sure. We've had to double our requests for more convict labor lately. He goes through them so fast." Lizen's eyebrows quirked at the screen in apparent mild disapproval. Inside, she was cursing a blue streak. "Lose any exotics? I know that Senior Engineer Talscott liked to collect odd aliens and raised hell whenever someone damaged them." "No, thankfully, or Karzoon would be missing a few things, too. They don't like each other much, though, and Karzoon's liable to make a mistake soon. He's got a new toy to play with right now, and he's fresh out of Marasine's to feed it. Mind teaching that hairless Mankrat a lesson for us, m'lady? We lack the rank." She allowed a dreadful smile to spread across her face. "I may have just the thing. Anything else I should know about?" "Maybe." The Tower Master looked a little nervous. "We've had a capital ship in for engine trouble for the best part of a week. There's a big shot of some sort aboard. Not sure who, but really high up. That's where Karzoon got his pet from, so be warned. I'll set you down near where he's got it penned, and he'll want to show it off to you anyway. Just follow the orange blinker drones to your dock. Oh, and be prepared to give him a zap. He's got dynastic ambitions, too." "Thanks for the warning," Lizen said sincerely. "Signing out, Tower." "Enjoy your stay, m'lady. Signing out." "Helpful fellow," Motri observed. "It's his job, and I know him of old." Lizen cocked a stern look at him. "You know your way around that warren well enough?" Motri smiled. "I was trained there. Fortunately, anyone inclined to remember this obstreperous pup out of the horde that infested those halls in my trainee days is likely to be gone. I've also rather changed in appearance since I last visited." She laid a gentle hand on the shoulder that had had to be replaced. "Just don't overdo it. Get those two humans and get back to the ship. Try not to get creative. That, my dear, arrogant and prideful lady, is your job." Station Master Karzoon was tall and whipcord thin, with a spotless, hand-tailored uniform that he was obviously very proud of. He was proud of his bloodline, too, a son of one of the planets colonized during the Great Dispersion, possibly the same world that the Emperor himself hailed from. Curzon was nearly hairless, slightly scaly, and small-eared. Adaptations that had made life easier on that desert world, but were often unattractive to the eyes of the original forest-dwelling stock. Lizen detested him immediately, and not just because she could trace her ancestry all the way back to the subarctic woodlands of Galran Prime. She didn't like his voice, which was monotonous and slightly nasal. She didn't like his posture, which was even more arrogant than hers when she was in a bad mood. She didn't like the way he smelled, which suggested that he had some unfortunate personal habits. She didn't like the look in his eyes, the oily smile on his narrow face, and especially not the deep bow he made to her when she stepped off of the ship. It was a standard courtesy, perhaps, but it also gave him an eagerly embraced opportunity to examine her from knees to neck. He also stood just that little bit too close, and it was a real trial not to rake her nails across his face. Still, her mother had drilled her extensively in polite behavior when she was a cub, and any lesson that old harpy had taught had a tendency to stay taught. And so it was that she stood patiently at the foot of the docking ramp with a pleasant expression on her face, while he recited a pretty little speech of welcome, with the drone tech standing by and alternately giving her looks of sympathy and shooting impatient glares at their oblivious boss. If nothing else, it served as a distraction that allowed Mudfree to sneak off unnoticed. Her sensitive ears had picked up the soft hush of the emergency hatch in the ship's undercarriage, and softer footsteps heading away some minutes ago. Eventually, Curzon ran out of flowery compliments to bestow upon her, and grandly waved the techs forward. She murmured a standard pleasantry to thank him for his welcome, and was not surprised when he did not head back to his office. "That's a Saranto cluster ship, isn't it?" he asked, looking curiously at the sleek blue plating. "I didn't know that there were any left." Well, the man had done his homework, at least. "Yes, a civilian model. Built more for comfort than for speed, but it suits my purposes. It was a coming-of-age gift from my aunt." She saw his eyes gleam, possibly estimating her family's wealth. Not many people got such rich gifts. "Modified, I assume? Those things were a tad unreliable, or so I have read. What have you got powering it, my lady?" "A standard yacht-grade Balmerian crystal system," she replied. "I had the tubes redone to the Imperial standard and added some pulse cannons in case of pirates. Thankfully, I haven't had trouble." Curzon nodded slowly, but looked a little puzzled. "Wise, my lady, but I thought that it was impossible to remove the original fusion pile drive from Saranto ships without ruining the life support systems." Lizen smiled. "It is. The fusion reactor's still there, but powered down. I use it as an emergency backup in case the crystal should crack. Yes, I know that those systems don't like being jostled, but it's another deterrent for aggressors. The lesser pods are original equipment as well, and can be sacrificed as high-grade missiles if the need should arise." Curzon swallowed hard, his composure rather dented as he realized that the big antique craft could very easily destroy most of the shipyard if the fusion drive went haywire. "I take care," she said sweetly, "to maintain both drives in perfect order, which is why I come here for service." We are honored by your confidence, m'lady," he said with a sickly smile. He might have gone on, but something large moved at the far end of the docking platform, and a growl like a major thunderstorm reverberated on the air. Lizen had been too distracted by the welcoming committee to notice it before, but there was a very large force-screen pen over there, and its occupant had just woken up. "What?" she said. "In the name of the Emperor's left eye is that?" Curzon turned to gaze at the enormous, awkward-looking creature with a sort of malicious affection. "That, my lady, is the proud creation of another of my guests. It is destined for glory at the center, where Hagar herself will use it to create a roe-beast to serve the Empire in its aims. The Druid wished the thing to get some exercise while her ship's engine was being tuned, and so we have been proud to offer our services." Lizen stared fixedly at the monster. It had been a person once. It wasn't one anymore. Possibly a Tenur or a Lopurian, but it had been so twisted and perverted that she couldn't tell for sure. It was a dull orange-red in color, was plated in huge, thick, rectangular scales, had rows of sharp spines down its back, possessed 3 legs like tree trunks, and had a pair of thick, muscular arms whose distorted hands hung nearly to the floor. It raised a fanged and horn-crowned head to bellow angrily, its 3 large purple eyes glaring around in mindless hunger. "What have you been feeding it?" she asked. Karzoon waved a hand airily. "Slaves, of course. What better fodder? It's a good way to get rid of the weak and obstreperous ones, and it makes the rest ever so much more tractable. I've already sent a man to bring up a couple for it. Would you like to watch it feed? It's quite enjoyable." There was another fearsome growl, though it came from behind them rather than from the monster. Karzoon jumped and yelped, spinning around to see Tilla at the top of the ship's docking ramp. "What is that?" Lizen glanced up and saw that Tilla was staring right at the beast at the other end of the platform, swollen with outrage and hissing like a steam engine. Soluk joined her at that point, and was no happier with what he saw. Lizen knew that the visiting druid would soon be missing a pet. There was no stopping an angry dragon. She smiled at the suddenly very nervous station master. "A pet project of my own. I call them Torinks. Let us see how well that ugly thing over there matches up to my beauties." Tilla and Soluk surged forward down the ramp, forcing Karzoon to leap out of the way. Soluk roared, a deep-voiced bellow that caught the monster's attention immediately. It screeched a challenge and charged the 4 screens. They held, barely, and it howled in rage and frustration. Tilla barked, showing her finger-long teeth, and both dragons leapt into a run. Motri's family was nowhere near so distinguished as his ladies. For centuries unnumbered, his ancestors had served the empire by seeing to it that its proud defenders were fed, clad, and supplied, and as soldiers. Always soldiers, as faceless in the histories as grains of sand. One of Motri's great-uncles, however, had aspired to a slightly higher calling by going into espionage. He'd seen something of himself in the bright-eyed cub, and had taught Motri a few important tricks of the trade. Tricks that served him well now as he ambled casually down the familiar halls. "Never run," great-uncle Xandris had told him. "Never run. Don't even hurry. Stride along briskly if you must, but remember, if you need to move fast, everything's already gone to hell. Be calm and exude an air of gentle reassurance. You belong there, wherever you might be. You are one of the staff. You have a perfect right to be there. Pay little outward attention to the upper ranks unless one of them gives you a direct order. It is astonishing how few of them are willing to get to know those who work for them." So far, he'd passed 2 sergeants, a colonel, and innumerable security guards, and none of them had paid him any mind at all. It had been simplicity itself to clone a pass card from an off-shift engineer in one of the staff break rooms, and now he was deep in the part of the shipyard station that visitors never saw. The back halls and private workshops where obscure parts were graded, stored, and repaired, and where the slaves and convict laborers were kept when not out on the docks. He walked into one of the old information alcoves that the local ship techs used to look up bits of this or that in the storerooms, and found it empty of even a sentry. What need of tight security down here when even the station master himself barely knew that they existed? The terminal came alight just fine, and he set about locating his objective. Base-grade laborers were officially classified as live resources, and he had no trouble in bringing the 2 aliens up, although he frowned when he saw where they were. According to the records, both of them were in detention at the moment, one for failure to comply with orders, and the other for attempting to strike a superior. More worrying was that the detention penalty was set for indefinite. On a hunch, he looked at the live resources detention records for the past week, and found that there had been a lot of indefinite penalties. Approximately 4 per day, which was rather more than those small, cramped cells could hold. Muttering a curse, he shut down the terminal and walked, briskly, to the detention area. The monster screamed again and rammed the force shields hard enough to make the generator spit sparks. Tilla boomed a derisive roar, prancing just out of reach. It snarled and began striking at the walls of its pen with trip-hammer fists, and finally the shield generator blew its fuse. The beast was loose, and it lunged after Tilla, who evaded its clumsy grab with disdainful ease. Lizen wasn't worried about them. The predators that they were, designed by nature to deal with, weren't quite as large as this thing, but they were a lot more agile and better balanced than the monster was. She was more worried about the frantic station master, who was gibbering in terror and begging her to call the dragons off. Not a chance of that, alas. Tilla and Soluk absolutely loathed creatures of this nature. Lizen was keeping all of her attention on her more unusual senses. She could feel the presence of the druid somewhere on board the big warship, and knew that it could sense its creation's rage. It might come to investigate what was happening. It would certainly notice when the 2 dragons killed its pet. All Lizen could do at this point was marshal her own resources, make sure of the items she kept for emergencies, and hope like hell that Motri would get back here before Soluk and Tella put their foe out of its misery. They were magnificent, though, as they danced around the lumbering 3-legged freak, getting the measure of its strengths and taking note of its weaknesses. Wise of them. This wasn't the first time that they'd encountered such perversions of nature, and such often had nasty surprises for the unwary. This one, at least, depended upon main strength and its collection of sharp points, and it wasn't long before they'd goaded it into bringing both spiky arms down in a blow that crumpled the decking. The creature's arm spikes also got wedged in the tough hull plate, allowing Tilla and Soluk to duck behind it and bury their fangs in its hind legs. It screamed, one last howl of shock and outrage before crumpling dead to the floor. Lizen felt the druid's surprise as it felt its monster die, and her nerves twanged at the pulse of power as it took the fastest route to the dock. Quintessence boosted. Damn. Lizen sighed and brought up her own protections as the masked and dark-robed druid appeared suddenly on the dock near them. "What has happened?" it demanded in a harsh, scratchy voice that sounded more mechanical than anything else. "Why was my beast set loose?" Karzoon gibbered incoherently, and Lizen pushed him aside. "It let itself loose, druid, and my own beasts took offense. Was that drooling pile of flesh the best that you could do?" The druid seemed to swell with fury, purple sparks crackling from its hands. "That was mine!" Lizen sneered. "Was it? I imagine that you spent long hours fondling its ears, you degenerate." The druid screeched and fired a bolt of dark energy at her. Motri was nearly too late. He found the cells easily enough, although he was nearly out of breath by the time he got there. But the cell he wanted had already been opened. A couple of guards were in the process of removing the prisoners, one of them holding the smaller male up off the floor by the scruff of his neck. The cub seemed pitifully small and thin when compared to the burly soldier. Motri didn't hesitate, but took a small stunner out of his kit and fired twice. He'd never had battle training beyond the basics, but he'd taken care to hone his aim, and the 2 guards crumpled to the floor in a moaning heap. The slave, who had dropped to his knees when he'd hit the floor, looked up at Motri in helpless terror. They'd cuffed his hands behind his back, poor cub, and from the look of him, whoever had been in charge of such things had been shorting his rations. "Hold still," Motri said, taking a decoder out of his kit and reaching for his cuffs. "Matt Holt, yes?" The cub gasped. "How did—" "Katie Holt sent me," Motri replied with a smile as the cuff snapped open. "She says that her mother will not permit you to go back to Kerberos, no matter how much you like freeze-dried peas. Home cooking is to be preferred." "Katie?" the cub squeaked. "How did she get all the way out here?" "She had help, and not from my people, believe me," Motri said, helping him up. "Ah, you are injured? Where is your father?" Matt had swayed unevenly on his feet, favoring the right leg. "It got infected and never healed right. Dad's in the other cell, but he's hurt too. That big jerk there knocked him down and kicked him." Motri grunted and stood up, adjusting his decoder until the neighboring cell door slid aside to reveal the older male, also thin and obviously in pain. He let the cub go in first and reassure the man before approaching. "Sam Holt," he said quietly, so as not to frighten him. "We need to leave now. Your daughter stands ready to cause a great deal of chaos, and I'd rather be out and away before we wind up in the middle of it." Cracked or broken ribs, Motri thought, observing the elderly human. "Damn, we won't be able to move fast." The human was brave, though, pulling himself to his feet without a whimper, and stumbled forward willingly enough. "Why are you helping us?" he asked in a dry voice. Many reasons, Modri said, herding them gently away from the cells, into which he shoved the guards before closing and locking the doors. Among them is that I owe one of her friends my life. Come on, we'll take it slowly. Nobody challenged them, which didn't surprise Modri much. Indeed, why should they? A senior ship tech with a couple of slaves in tow was too common a sight to bother with, although the cub was very nervous and the older male was sweating with the effort. He let them rest as often as he dared, but never for as long as they needed. His caution paid off, however, when a crowd of terrified drone technicians stampeded past them, followed by the station master himself. "Run!" they shouted in passing. "Stay clear! There's a mage battle going on in Dock 84! Dock 84. That was where the Chimera's clutch was. How the hell had Lizen gotten into a fight with another witch? "Podfic!" he cursed, and beckoned to the two humans. "Come on, we're almost there." Lizen deflected another bolt of purple light with a snap of her wrist, then teleported away before another landed. The enraged druid was expending tremendous amounts of energy without noticeably weakening. She distracted it enough to let the two dragons get back on board ship, at least, but Modri hadn't yet returned. If he didn't show up soon, she would have to unleash her allies earlier than she'd wanted to. The only thing that would distract this creature enough to get past its guard at this point was a full-on giant robot attack. At this rate, she was certainly going to have to do something drastic. There were too many secrets that needed keeping, and she would probably have to kill the druid to do that. There! She spotted Modri lurking in a doorway with two smaller persons in slave colors close by him. Grinning fiercely at the druid, she generated a cloud of bright needles and forced it to teleport, then jumped 7 times in quick succession to various points on the dock. On the 5th jump, she left something behind. Modri caught the thrown item and smiled when he saw what it was. With a nod, he offered it to his companions. "Push the button. I give you this right. It will summon Katie." The cub jabbed the signaler's switch without hesitation. The signal was answered immediately. Alora barely had time to alert her paladins before they were out and away, the green lion at the fore. Within minutes, Atelca shipyard got the shock of its life when Voltron roared into its traffic lanes and fired a shot across its bow that torched off an entire fleet of brand-new Galra fighters. The impact and shockwave of the bolt shook the entire station from one end to the other, knocking the druid off balance. Lizen had been expecting something like this, and seized on the opportunity, whipping a dagger out of one sleeve and sinking it up to the hilt in the druid's shoulder. It screamed and teleported away, leaving Lizen alone on the trembling dock. "It's gone!" she shouted. "Everybody get on board now! We are leaving!" Modri wasted no time in herding his charges up the ramp and into the ship. "Will it come back?" he asked. "Not likely," Lizen panted, heading for the bridge. "The dagger was anointed with some of Soluk's venom, but that druid was hopped up on at least a city's worth of quintessence. Even if it doesn't die, it'll be very ill for a while. I'm more worried about the battleship, to be honest. I see that you had no trouble." She cast her eyes over their guests, who stared warily back at her. Modri shook his head and waved them toward a pair of passenger seats. "Almost none. A couple of guards, easily dealt with. Time was our true enemy, Lizen. Another day, another hour, and we would have been too late." Lizen growled and brought the ship to life. "A curse on Karzun! His wastefulness nearly skewed everything. May his uniforms never fit right. My goodness, look at that!" The Chimera's clutch had risen above the docking arm at just the right angle to see the colossal robot slice one of the big cruisers in half as smaller ships sped in flocks around it, the civilian craft fleeing for their lives, and the fighters attempting to keep formation in the disorganized swarm of panicking pilots. "Magnificent," Modri observed. Is Katie driving that?" a boy's voice asked behind them. "Part of it," Lizen replied, throwing the ship into drive. "The green arm. It's a Gestalt engine, requiring 5 bonded pilots. A little clumsy in the training phases, perhaps, but a seasoned team is a force to be reckoned with, both in and out of the lines." Modri gasped and tapped a screen. "Lizen! The druid's ship is launching, and it's following us. Lizen cursed and hauled on the control yoke, narrowly avoiding a huge beam of purple incandescent death. And curse the vindictive! Why won't they take the bait like sensible people, especially when it's so big and colorful? Shields up and tell our friends that we've got trouble. It was a stiff fight, but the paladins were more than up for it. Pidge's anxieties and Allure's misgivings had been affecting the entire team's spirits, and, as a result, everybody had been spoiling for a fight for days. Even so, it wasn't quite enough for Pidge, who scanned around constantly for a cluster of blue eggs. "Where are they?" she muttered, blowing another fighter to pieces. "Where are they? Come on, guys, you promised." She nearly jumped out of her seat when a familiar voice rang through her comm. "Paladins, we have the humans, alive but not safe. Look to your starboard side. We are being followed and need your help." That was Modri, sounding strained, and there was a low-voiced string of what sounded like swear words in the background. Her eyes flashed to the right, where a vast purple destroyer was showering a much smaller ship with ion blasts. "We see you!" Shiro shouted, and Pidge felt Voltron surge forward to deal with that threat. "We're coming!" Other large ships rose in defense of the capital craft, slowing them down and getting in the way. Pidge groaned as the Chimera's clutch had its shields stripped away under that barrage. "Hunk, we need that cannon!" "On it!" Hunk said, and ships exploded like fireworks all around, but there were still too many. "It's no good," Lizen's voice snarled. "We're not agile or fast enough and the shields are going. Drastic measures, people. Get to the pod. Now, I said, and carry them if you have to." A minute later, the clutch's shields failed, and the lesser eggs split off from the main fuselage as a beam of hot ions burned against naked hull plate. The lesser eggs, at least 10 of them, burst into drive on their own tubes, streaking off in all different directions. The main egg seemed to flicker, and then exploded with such force that the destroyer was blown in half. Even Voltron was pushed back by that blast, and every ship in the area was knocked for a loop. Pidge screamed in denial, one long, agonized howl of loss and woe that trailed off in sobs. "Chimera's clutch! Clutch, do you read me?" Karan called over the comm channels, but there was only the hissing of static for several long, terrible seconds. Then, miraculously, a voice filtered in out of the ion-scrambled mess. "Son of a spavined hoop-twick, but my aunt is going to have the loss of that ship out of my hide. This is going to make things very inconvenient. Hello out there. We've managed to survive that blast, but our pod's drive blew out. May we beg a rescue anyway? Matt, be a dear and call your sister to us. Katie?" A boy's voice, achingly familiar to Pidge's ears, sounding shaken. "Katie, we're all right. We're alive, but Dad needs help." "We're coming, Matt," Pidge replied, dashing tears from her eyes. "We're coming. Keep talking so that we can find your pod. What's wrong with Dad?" It didn't take long to find the pod, thankfully enough, and the lions brought it into the castle's main hangar bay with no trouble at all. Unfortunately, it wouldn't stay upright. The tubes and landing gear hadn't survived the explosion, and so the thing had to be propped up between the red and yellow lions. Their paladins dismounted and turned to have a look at their capture. "Looks like an Easter egg that somebody tried to flame broil," Keith observed. Hunk's stomach grumbled predictably, and he groaned. "Don't talk to me about eggs, all right? I've been craving deviled eggs for weeks." Pidge dashed up, looking for any signs of life, Shiro and Lance beside her. "Oh, wow," she said, surveying the damage. "We might have to cut them out of there. I can't see the hatch." "It could just hatch," Lance said. "You know, looking like a big egg and all." Shiro gave him a quelling glance, and then turned to see Karan and Allura running to join them. "Paladins!" Karan said urgently. "We have to get them out of that pod, and then get that pod out of here as fast as we can. That's from a Sorrento ship, and they had a bad habit of using their extra-life pods as fusion missiles. That thing could blow at any minute." There was a clonk from inside the egg that made them all jump, and then the outline of a hatch appeared on the scorched surface. It got stuck halfway and had to be shoved aside by a tall, thin, and very tired-looking Galra. Lance reacted immediately, bringing his Bayard out and aiming it at the purple alien. "Don't move!" The Galra merely sighed and sat down on the threshold. Far more terrifying was the lavender-furred woman who loomed up behind him, topaz eyes burning. "Don't you dare," she snarled. Lance had grown up in a very large, very close-knit family. He had heard that tone of voice before, and feared it. It triggered certain responses in his subconscious mind, and he found himself shrinking away with his Bayard hidden behind his back and a sheepish grin on his face. Pidge squealed, and he realized belatedly that the Galra woman was holding an injured man in her arms, and a teenaged boy, bearing a distinct resemblance to Pidge, was peering over the sitting Galra's shoulder. "Sam!" Shiro said, starting forward. "Matt, you're all right!" The Galra eased himself down to the deck and helped the boy down so that Pidge could grab him up in a huge bear hug and weep all down his chest. Shiro smiled and nodded at him. "Murray, you're looking better?" Murray smiled grimly and braced his back against the hull of the pod. "Compared to the first time you saw me, yes. Thank you again, by the way. Ah, just passing down gently, Lizen." Lizen was standing very still, eyes locked on Alura's in a shared glare that you could bend U-bolts around. The princess was not at all happy to have them here, and Lizen did not take hostility well. Murray's soft-spoken words distracted her long enough to hand down her passenger into Shiro's arms. Sam Holt was unconscious and pale, and far too thin for comfort. Lizen turned and headed back into the pod, shouting at something inside. Murray grunted wearily. "Get that man to the medical station as soon as you can. He's got broken ribs, among other things." There was a disgruntled gronk from inside the pod, and he smiled. "Also, be warned, Lizen brought the dragons." Tilla and Soluk, at least, had no trouble adapting to their new situation. They greeted Shiro and Hunk with great eagerness, whiffling them all over before sneezing and giggling girlishly. Everyone else got the same treatment as well. Keith seemed to enjoy it, and so did Lance after he got over his initial nerves. Pidge and Matt had to be sniffed together because she wouldn't let go of her brother, and Coran was perfectly happy to return the gesture. Allura bore it with a slightly fixed smile, and even the mice got a good whiffle in before disappearing back into their own places in the castle. It was Lizen and Modri who were having a bit more trouble. Well, Lizen mostly. Modri was content to sit at her feet while looking as harmless as possible, but there was something in Lizen's posture that suggested instant violence if anyone made a wrong move. Hunk commented on it first. "Switch to decaf, will you? You're starting to make Allura jumpy, and she gets mean when she's jumpy." She gave him a long, blank look, but then seemed to collect herself. "Sorry," she said with an apologetic glance at the princess. "It's instinctive. My man is injured. I'm in the territory of an unfamiliar woman. I've recently been in a fight with a very dangerous foe. I've lost my own territory, and we may or may not be among friends. I've also just given up 2 valuable hostages as per the agreement, and my gut is telling me that that was a very bad idea." Modri chuckled softly. "We're all so tired, dirty, sore, hungry, and have just revealed ourselves as traitors to the Empire in at least 3 different ways. It's been a bad day." Hunk considered that. "Give me a few ticks," he said, and headed out of the hangar. The 2 Galra watched him go with puzzled looks and then turned their attention to their hosts. Coran had already moved the ruined pod out of the castle, and just in time it blew up rather spectacularly a few minutes after being ejected. And now there were 3 separate arguments going on. Pidge was trying to get Matt to tell her what had happened over the past year or so. Allura was more interested in getting the unwanted aliens out of her house. Shiro and Matt were objecting to her lack of hospitality towards someone who had just been of great help, and the red and blue paladins were offering unsolicited opinions on just about everything. The dragons were sitting off to one side, watching the fun with interest. This might have continued indefinitely if the elevator doors hadn't opened when they did. Humans and Alteans stopped shouting immediately and turned as one to face it, as a pair of unmistakable aromas wafted over them. "Hey guys," Hunk said, holding up a large bowl of golden brown, bacon-scented objects in one hand, and a slightly smaller bowl of something pink in the other. "Lunch! Come on, let's get upstairs and talk like civilized people, okay? See you there." The doors closed just before Keith and Lance could crowd in with him, forcing them to wait until the lift came back down. "10 rook buns and Altean Salen Rajel," Lizen said, rubbing at her eyes. "By all the gods, the boy is a genius." Modri laughed and hauled himself to his feet. "Genius should be encouraged." It was later, and tensions had eased somewhat. Hunk had bullied the kitchen into making an enormous amount of food, most of which had vanished, and the last few Tenruk buns were currently being fed to Soluk, who had laid his enormous spiny head on Alora's lap. This served to keep her too distracted to say anything unfortunate, which was a blessing because it gave Matt some room to speak. "We were traded around a lot," he said. "Dad and I have a lot of scientific skills that most of the other prisoners didn't, and that made us valuable. They had us grading rare minerals in the first camp we were sent to, and then working on equipment maintenance, and then our overseer lost us in a card game to some other guy who put us to work in manufacturing circuit lattices. Then it was building robots until his boss stole us, and, well, a lot of other jobs. We were eventually given to Senior Engineer Talscott as a birthday present. He wasn't a bad guy, but whoever was in charge of feeding the slaves had his budget cut 3 times. Dad, his health hasn't been good lately, and the short rations didn't help. He collapsed when one of the guards had him hauling crates of engine parts and started kicking him. I tried to fend them off, but that didn't go real well. They told us that we were going to be monster fodder. And then he showed up." Matt pointed at Modri, who had been persuaded with some difficulty to sit on the lounge's comfortable couch instead of on the floor at Lizen's feet. As it was, he was sticking very close to her. Lizen didn't seem to mind this at all, and had draped an arm possessively around his shoulders. Modri gave him a tired smile. "Are you complaining?" "No," Matt said firmly. "It just came as a surprise, is all." "Sometimes surprises are welcome," Shiro said, casting the pair an interested look. "What happened? That big destroyer should have been more interested in catching Voltron." Lizen snorted and replied sourly, "The fates conspired against me. Modri here had no trouble at all in finding and acquiring his objectives, fortunate fellow. I must have given him all my luck. The station master was new and determined to make a good impression by showing off a monster that he'd been babysitting. The destroyer, you see, was transporting a druid." "A druid?" Lance yelped. "You mean one of those beaky things that pop in and out and try to burn Keith into a charcoal briquette and miss?" Lizen lifted an eyebrow at Keith. "Yes, although they tend not to miss. You must be very fast, Paladin." "And lucky," Keith admitted. "Yes. The druid had created something large and nasty that was to be delivered to Parzarak, a little gift for Hagar to work with, that she might pass it on, with modifications, to you." Lizen reached up and rubbed Tilla's chin. "You should thank the dragons, by the way. They put the poor thing out of its misery for you. Unfortunately, the druid took offense. We fought and I had to knife the creature." "It was awesome," Matt said with a big grin. "They were blinking in and out of sight like fireflies, and the druid was blasting everything with purple lightning, and Lizen tossed Modri the signaler. He let me call you myself. Then something big hit the station, and she stabbed the druid right through the shoulder." "Poisoned knife. Quite a good one," Modri murmured fondly, leaning his head on Lizen's shoulder. "She always did have excellent taste in weapons. The druid was no longer a problem, so we took the opportunity to leave. Alas, the destroyer's captain objected to her treatment of his important passenger. Treason, it seems, was more offensive to his mind than giant robots." "Yeah, we couldn't get to you in time," Pidge said. "Sorry about that. Why did your ship blow up like that? It took out that destroyer and 2 docking arms." "Fusion pile reactor," Lizen said with a smirk. "A little bit of an antique, that. It basically generates a very small star in order to power the ship's systems. The energy yield is great, but it doesn't like being shot at. Pirates avoid that sort of craft, which is why my aunt gave it to me. I like to travel, and my aunt always fretted over my safety. Damn, getting a new ship is going to be difficult. I am sorry to have to ask this of you, Princess, but I must beg a bunk for my menagerie here until I can do that." "Won't your aunt give you another one?" Hunk asked before Allura could speak. "Ha! No." Lizen rubbed absently at the fur behind Modri's ear, making him sigh happily. "My family is as loyal to the Emperor as any of his generals. By now, Zarkon and his witch will know that I've gone rogue, and my name and image will have already been broadcast as being wanted dead or alive. Alive, preferably, so that Hagar can use me in her experiments. I expect that my folks will have declared me as dead and disowned, the better to protect their own interests." "You'll be in good company," Modri said, looking up at her adoringly. "I've been officially dead for over a year. It's not too bad." "Yes, dear, but I did like having that freedom of movement. I can afford a new ship, that's not the problem. The trick will be in finding a dealer that is willing to do business with a couple of zombies." "Well, Princess?" Allura looked reluctant. "I'm not sure that I like that idea." Lizen nodded, Quite understandable. I promise that I will be on my best behavior, and that Modri here will do the same. We are able to pay our way. Modri was a very able starship technician before he was forced into command, and I have talents and techniques that will serve your paladins well. None of you know how to fight druids. I do, and I can teach you. I'm also a skilled medic, a good pilot, a decent cook, and both of us know how the Empire functions today, as opposed to the information you have on file, which is 10 millennia out of date. Even the dragons may contribute their strengths as shipboard security. Pity the invader who boards this castle uninvited. Tilla grinned. She had an excellent set of fangs. Allura looked down at Soluk, who winked at her, and then up at the faces of her friends. All right, I suppose, but only until you can find a new ship. There was a faint snore. Modri had fallen asleep against Lazen's shoulder. Lazen puffed a faint laugh and caressed his face gently, a tender gesture that sent a pang of unknown emotions through Allura's heart. Thank you, although shopping will have to wait. Modri pushed himself harder than he should have today. He is by no means completely recovered. Allura glanced at Shiro. I was told that he'd been injured. Lazen undid the catches on Modri's shirt and folded the fabric back, revealing his chest. The ribs and shoulder bones were plainly visible beneath the fine purple fur, and scars snaked over his torso like lightning bolts. When I pulled him from the charnel pit, there was very little of him left. He still had both eyes, which was a mercy, but the left shoulder and arm were gone, as was the right arm from the elbow down. Several of his major organs had been replaced with mechanical systems, along with half of his pelvis, 2 sections of his spinal column, and both legs. I'm amazed that he held on to as much of his sanity as he did. Those butchers had done their best to drive him completely mad. Replacing what he had lost took a great deal of effort. He may never regain his full strength. Shiro shuddered and flexed his mechanical hand, well aware that he'd gotten off very lightly. Believe it or not, Princess, there are Galra who object to this sort of thing as much as you do. I'm one of them, and Modri, for obvious reasons, is another. Doubtless we will have to settle our differences with each other, but this is not the time. If you would please find a room for us, I need to get him into a proper bed. Allura had been staring in horror at the amount of damage that Modri had sustained. All right, I can do that. If your dragon will let me up. Soluk snorted and lifted his head with solemn dignity off of her knees, licking her once, gently, on one cheek before resting his head on his foreclaws. Allura felt itchy. It wasn't a physical sensation, but the itch was there, nagging, persistent, and maddening. She had the terrible feeling that something wasn't quite right, and it was really starting to get on her nerves. It wasn't the paladins, who were as boisterous as ever, more so now that Pidge's father was out of the medical pod and happily examining the castle's mechanisms with his daughter. It wasn't the dragons, who were surprisingly genial and polite house guests. It wasn't Karan, who was, well, very much himself. It wasn't even Modri, who had gracefully agreed to wear a security bracelet that let the castle's AI keep an eye on his movements. Lazen had accepted one with less grace, and then had vanished into the depths of the castle's unused wings. Allura did not like that. She didn't like having Golra in the house, period. She didn't like the idea of having a rogue witch do rogue things so near to the lions, and now, Allura raged within herself, she couldn't even concentrate on anything. Something weird was going on, she could feel it, and it was driving her nuts. Goaded unmercifully by this sensation, she had taken up her post on the bridge to run scans on the ship, trying to find the source of the trouble. "Worried about something, Princess?" Karan asked her. "Something's wrong, Karan, I can feel it," Allura said, running scans on the engine level and coming up with nothing more than a bit of debris. "I just can't pinpoint it." Karan tugged his mustache. "Could be the castle trying to tell you something, yeah. Your mother could tell if there was so much as a napkin out of place in the kitchen storage, and your father once spent the whole day fretting before we found the infestation of bockles in the basement. Took a week to get rid of them, and longer to clean the mess out of the walls. Could it be the lions?" "No, they test clean," Allura said, scowling at her screens. "It's something... Aha! Look here!" There was one anomaly on the ship's diagram, a spot in the north wing that was shifting in and out of focus. Coran squinted at it for a moment and then straightened up with a smile. I remember that one. That's one of the upper entertainment suites, where Countess Atelca used to hold parties while visiting your aunt. Small parties and very exclusive, and the rumors that came out of those were a bit unlikely. I know that the cleaning staff always dreaded having to deal with the aftermath. I don't remember them bending time and space like that, though. I am going to investigate, Allura said triumphantly, pulling a small stun gun from a hidden compartment in the console. If I'm not back within the hour, send the paladins up to help. Feeling very daring, Allura headed up to the deserted entertainment deck, stunner at the ready and an odd mix of relief and excitement coursing through her veins. It was a long trip, which served to leech off some of that feeling. Sometimes even she forgot just how big and empty the castle was. The halls were wide here, which was typical of the more exalted apartments, and she was able to spot her objective from a considerable distance away. The doors stood open, and the hall before them was lit with a faint golden effulgence. There was also a soft sound coming from them, regular, rhythmic, almost like music. Chanting, she realized. Someone was performing a ritual. There was only one person with knowledge of that sort on the ship, and Allura relished the thought of giving that individual a good zap. Carefully, very carefully, she eased forward, the words coming clearer as she did so. Taisha tahemok, sakur tahemok, altakethan solmavar. The words meant nothing to her. Allura peered cautiously around the doorframe and stared, transfixed at what she saw. The room's lights had been deactivated, and yet was full of subtle patterns of light. They wafted like strands of fine silk on the air, coursed over the walls, floor, and ceiling like circuit diagrams, formed sheets of peculiar symbols in odd corners, and webbed in profusion around a single figure in the center of the room. Lizen was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her fingers steepled before her face and her eyes closed. The security bracelet anchored into the golden web and turning the filaments blue where they connected. There were sheets of that same blue meshing with the designs on every flat surface as well, the lights pulsing in time with her chanting. Sambak setalanthvas, svaral antukorankka. As Allura watched, images began forming in the web before her. Vague at first, then slowly gaining definition. She experienced a shock when she saw the castle resolve out of the glow. The shields were up, she saw, and it was being attacked. The image dissolved as quickly as it had formed, and Lizen frowned. Thursa tahimok, habef tahimok, tannaloran thorayol. Golden lines moved strangely in an oddly rhythmic pattern, and this resolved into an image of the lions, galloping together over an unfamiliar terrain. As she watched, they formed Voltron and flashed away to face an unseen foe. Lizen grunted, and there was grim determination in her voice now. Amachzu tahemok, parachai tahemok, ban mitragalat sinitralvash. This time the black lion appeared, alone and yet not alone. There were two other figures near its feet, but they were blurry and indistinct, moving in sudden, violent bursts. Lizen's breath hissed between her teeth. The image blurred, cleared, blurred again, and then the images were superimposed over the lions in sudden, frightful clarity. Shiro fighting mad. Zarkon obsessed and insane. They melded with the lion's cephalon, separated, flashing between being and non-being in a fury of activity, until the lion roared in rage. Allura leaped out of hiding and fired her weapon. The witch's eyes flashed open, and the bolt was deflected away by a hard spark of golden light. Another gold flash lanced out, and the stunner came apart in Allura's hand. This did not stop her from tackling Lizen bodily to the floor. Alteans are tougher than they look. Despite appearing to be as slender as a reed and as delicate as fine lace, Allura was perfectly capable of picking the paladin of her choice up and breaking him over her knee. Lizen went over easily, the golden lights vanishing. The only lights in the room now were her furious eyes. Galra were no slouches where it came to physical strength either. Lizen was used to an active life, and had kept herself fit. Allura had taken her by surprise, but the shock wore off very quickly. Allura soon found herself trying to deal with a furious bundle of sinew and whipcord that could see far better in the dark than she could. Allura fought grimly for supremacy against her worst nightmare, until a powerful kick to her hip forced her away. "You fool, girl, what is this all about?" A harsh voice snarled out of the darkness, barely recognizable as Lizen's. "Filthy witch, I will not allow you to curse my paladins!" Allura snapped back, flowing to her feet. "I will have you spaced for this! Lights on!" The room flashed a light, showing that Lizen had also regained her feet, and they sprang at each other in a fury. Allura was grimly pleased to find that her foe had been as well drilled in unarmed combat as she had. Part of her would have been terribly disappointed if this had been too easy. Lizen seemed to feel the same way, and attacked without mercy. Outside the door, 7 figures, 5 in armor, 1 who fiddled constantly with his mustache, and 1 furry, purple, and worried waited, listening to the shrieks and curses of a first-class catfight. Lance fidgeted slightly. "Think we should go in there?" "No," the others chorused. "But what if they start ripping each other's clothes off?" Lance said hopefully. "I mean, I wouldn't want to miss..." Shiro's right hand, the one made of metal, had clamped over his face. "That's enough. They need to work this out for themselves." "Shh, I'm trying to listen," Hunk hissed. "Hey, Modri, what does Gorzabek mean?" "You aren't old enough to be told," Modri said, wincing at the bad language being traded around in there. Lungs heaving, the 2 angry women strained against each other, scratched and bruised and nearly out of energy. "Kantik barvash, you miserable little bitra! I wasn't cursing the paladins," Lizen panted, trying for a chokehold. Allura wriggled out of that grip, tried for purchase on Lizen's shoulder, and felt her sweating hands slide uselessly through the short, soft fur there. "Using them, then? You're trying to control them, to use them for your own ends, you gorok aus." "So are you," Lizen growled. "So is Voltron. So is the whole bloody universe. Not one of those children were given a choice in this, nor are they likely to be given one. Slaves to a purpose, every one of them." Allura snarled in fury and hooked a leg around Lizen's knee, trying to upset her balance. "I am not using them for anything!" Lizen dropped, trapping Allura's foot between ankle and thigh and bringing her down hard on her rump. "Lies, girl. You're using them, all right. Think I'm blind? You avenge yourself on my people every time they run out and play with those overgrown cats of theirs. Every time they break a ship, Galra die. Wear guild for your own lost father. Galra destroy everything they touch, and what they don't destroy they enslave!" Allura gasped, twisting free and lunging again. "My father died trying to stop them, and failed, dooming both your people and mine," Lizen hissed and blocked her grab, flipping her neatly to the floor again. "If that fool had assembled Voltron and squashed Zarkon flat when he had the chance, trillions of lives would have been spared. Yours is not the only people who risk extinction, and others have gone to the grave before us as testament to his stupidity. Mine may well follow." "What do you mean, the Golra facing extinction?" Allura panted, glaring daggers at her rival. "Nothing of the sort! You swarm in your billions while my people—" "For now." Lizen's voice was dead, and sounded like it wanted to spread that around. "Only for now. Voltron will very likely defeat Zarkon. Even if it doesn't, something else will. Zarkon is the one unifying force holding the Empire together. He is the eternal Emperor, and all other peoples grovel in terror before him. How will they react, do you think, when he is no longer there?" Allura gasped, realizing the dreadful truth. Her own history held numerous examples of what had happened to despotic regimes when the tyrant died. This would be far, far worse. Lizen smirked. "Yes, you can see it now, can't you? Most of what the rest of the universe sees of us is our military, a greedy, thieving, murderous pack of tyrants as ever one could hope to avoid. The subject peoples see the Emperor, and hear him, and fear his engines of destruction. Worse, the governors that Zarkon is set to administer them abuse them freely, and without fear of retribution. and not one of those fools can hope to support his authority without the Emperor's forces backing him up. My people will be slaughtered in revenge for what that miserable madman has both done and not done, and not even Voltron, not even you will be able to convince several thousand blood-crazed peoples to stop. Lizen bared her teeth. The best that I can hope for is either exile or captivity. The most likely is oblivion. You, at least, will still have a home to go back to. I very much doubt that I will. Many would say that it was well deserved, Allura growled. It is, Lizen said with a simple matter-of-factness that brought the princess up short. What has been done is unforgivable. The problem is that the innocent will get lined up and shot along with the guilty. Is it the fault of the cubs, girl? If their fathers and uncles have been committing atrocities, will the common folk be forgiven the sins of the mighty? They will not. The mob does not care, and it does not make distinctions. Without the Empire to keep the peace, there will be no law, only the mob. You will be fighting that mob for the rest of your life, and the paladins will be your tools. You may have to build a new empire of your own, just to keep general war from breaking out. That's how ours got started. Sarkhan was forced to form his own empire out of the ashes of the old domains in order to keep my people from destroying themselves, and in time became precisely what he had fought against in the beginning. Allura shivered, and tears began to trickle down her cheeks. Then what is it all for? What's it all for? A pair of soft furred arms encircled her shoulders, and Allura collapsed weeping on Lizen's breast. Heroes, Lizen chuckled. Lovely people, but they never think far enough ahead. To vanquish evil, of course. To remove from the field the great villains, the world killers, the unconquerably power-mad. It probably won't be quite as bad as I've made it out to be, but you'll have your fill of petty tyrants and bloodthirsty crowds before long. And I haven't even touched on the infighting that will go on over the power vacuum that Sarkhan will leave behind him. There are at least 10 or 20 princes hanging around, all of whom are potential figureheads and leaders of powerful and greedy factions. Politics. That's why I ran away from home as soon as I got my pilot's license. Allura sniffled. Then why do you want to help us, if Voltron's triumph means disaster for the Golra? Lizen sighed and patted her head. Think, girl. Disaster will happen anyway. If Voltron does manage to pull it off, then the paladins, and you, will gain the people's respect. They will grant you favors and do as you ask. If we help you, you will realize that no one race has the sole rights to either evil or virtue, and you might ask the Empire's former subjects to spare the innocent. Probably in return for the disposal of the guilty, I'm afraid, and that's going to get rather nasty in spots. I'm willing to play for simple survival, since the status quo will no longer be possible to maintain. I want a place for my children in this universe, one that is not a cage in a zoo somewhere, or in a display case in a museum. Can you allow us that? Allura nodded, leaning back. I think so. I'm sorry. No more than I, Lizen said, rolling a shoulder with a crackle of sore joints. It's a tremendous responsibility for both of us, and we may not survive it. Allura rested her elbows on her knees, eyeing Lizen narrowly. I still don't like or trust Golra. That's a personal problem that I'm just going to have to deal with. Lizen laughed, a rusty, parched sound. Fine. Go ahead. It's an attitude that will serve you well for the time being. You annoy me too, by the way. Just don't make sweeping generalizations anymore and I'll be happy. Right. So, what exactly were you doing anyway? Before I interrupted, I mean. Lizen growled under her breath and flopped down on her back on the floor. I was attempting to scry, to get a peek at the future. I'm not at all good at it, and I'm going to be annoyed with you for a while for breaking up the most successful session that I've had in years. Even so, all I can reliably say about it is that there is going to be a lot of action, and that Shiro is going to have a very great deal of difficulty in keeping his lion. That big cat is going to have to make a choice as well. Will you try again? Allura asked. Lizen waved a hand. No, not now. Later, maybe, when things have quieted down a little. To observe something is to change it, and there are too many lines of probability starting to come to a head right now to poke around at random. Besides, wrestling with you has worn me out. I would far rather clean up and take a nap. Oh, and mend my shirt. You too, Allura. After giving the boys listening up there in the hall a few minutes to clear off before we have to kick them around, of course. There was a faint, "Oops, busted," from the hall, and a whispered, "Run!" and a soft clatter of hurrying feet. Allura giggled. How could you tell? Lizen tugged at one ear. These aren't just for show. Come on, I want a drink. You will too, I expect. Allura realized that she was parched and sore. Yes, I think so. We've still got some Numville, and I could really use a cup.